The bell belonged to no one. It was not forged, not hung in any tower, nor did it wait to be struck. It was an ancient resonance, a vibration moving through time like a fracture stretched across the order of existence itself. When it rang, space did not change. Rather, what had been concealed for too long was forced to tremble. Dracula heard the bell. He stood within the great hall of an ancient citadel, where the vaulted ceiling rose so high that light never reached its highest point. Dark stone columns lined the hall on either side, carved with sigils and royal crests whose edges had long since dulled, yet whose forms still held, like the dead who refused to collapse. Torchlight flickered unevenly along the walls, pushing shadows into constant motion. Nothing here was truly still. No shadow lingered long enough to be called safe. At the center of it all, Dracula stood upright. He carried the bearing of a cultivated nobleman, back straight, shoulders open, his movements restrained to the edge of ritual. His attire was dark and unadorned, yet every cut bore the weight of authority inherited through blood. This was not the posture of a usurper, but that of a lord who had once sworn to remain standing until no one else could. Yet the space around him no longer harmonized. High-hung banners stirred without wind, old fabric releasing a dry, brittle sound, like the breath of oaths stretched far beyond their time. Royal emblems that had once stood for protection and sacrifice now seemed only to witness their own neglect. The stone floor beneath his feet was cold, cold beyond the range of human sensation, and Dracula felt it. The human part of him remembered this chill well. Nights spent upon the ramparts, blood seeping beneath armor, the fear of the people pressing fully onto his shoulders. He remembered the moment he chose to remain, to accept the curse in exchange for the survival of the realm. In those days, sacrifice had still carried meaning. Now the bell did something else. It did not summon glory. It tightened invisible chains that had long coiled around him, chains of obedience, of being permitted to exist without ever being allowed to choose. The ancient curse constricted not like pain, but like habit, something embedded so deeply in the blood that it no longer announced itself. The space reacted. The royal reliefs carved into the walls appeared to deepen, as though the light had lost the will to touch them. The faces of old kings emerged half lit and half swallowed by shadow, those who had chosen sacrifice and those whom history had forgiven. Dracula did not turn, but within his gaze something else began to surface. Not darkness, but the lingering tremor of restrained divinity. It did not belong to the curse, nor to corruption. It was the force that had kept him standing when everything else collapsed, the presence that had guarded his kingdom even when the world had turned away. The space sensed it. Torch flames froze for a single fragile beat. Shadows recoiled, hesitating. The vaulted ceiling seemed lower, not because it had fallen, but because it no longer held enough distance to sustain its former grandeur. Dracula stood within all of it, suspended between the man who had sacrificed, the being bound by corruption, and something that rose beyond them both. The bell did not demand action, it demanded confrontation with the truth that the human within him had not died, that the curse had not loosened its hold, and that the divine, though chained, had never bowed. The space trembled ever so slightly, like an old kingdom remembering why it had once been worth protecting. Darak was not desolate. It was refined through suffering. The ground here was not bare. From fissures in black ice and glass-like stone, blood flowers rose, their petals thick and dark crimson, as though nourished by life-blood still warm. They released no fragrance, they breathed. Each faint pulse was barely perceptible, as if the flowers still remembered the heartbeat of those who had fed them. Between these beds, black crystal thrust upward from the earth in transparent spires, catching the distant glow of nebulae and fracturing it into cold hues of red and violet. Seen up close, the crystal was not hollow. Dark currents coiled within, like memories compressed so tightly they could no longer escape. There were no straight paths in Darak. The walkways curved between hedges of black roses, their trunks twisted, their thorns long and hooked like barbs. Old scars layered over new ones along every thorn, dried into a deep, muted shade. The roses bloomed slowly, painfully slowly. As one petal opened, another had already begun to wither. In Darak, flowering and decay shared the same moment. The wind passed through without cold, carrying instead the whisper of bone. Ivory spines rose from the stone like natural barricades, their surfaces uneven, their tips curved toward the gray sky. They did not belong to any creature left whole. They were remnants of what had been offered, shattered, and left behind. When the wind touched them, it produced a thin, brittle sound like metal brushing metal during a ritual that no longer had a presiding hand. Above it all, Dracula's fortress stood in silence. Its walls were forged of dark stone, veined with glass, cracked by design, as if broken in order never to shatter. Its spires rose not to challenge the sky, but to affirm endurance. Every block bore the trace of dried blood, not splashed, but soaked in slowly and deeply. Dracula walked through Darak. He did not command the landscape to bow. The land recognized him. Blood flowers inclined their petals by the smallest margin. Black crystal held its reflection steady. The black roses did not draw their thorns closed. The bone spines did not tremble. Everything remained still within a familiar order, the order of a place that had learned to exist alongside its master. Here, beauty was not meant to soothe. It was meant to remind that everything which endures pays a price, that beauty preserved too long begins to ache, and that Darak was not a realm of death, but a realm of wounded continuation. Dracula halted beside a bed of black roses. One petal fell, yet did not touch the ground. A thorn caught it, suspending it in place, beautiful to the point of cruelty. In that instant, the human part of him remembered loving beauty for its fragility. The curse understood that fragility must be replaced with endurance, and the part that rose above both, the restrained divine, simply observed without judgment. Darak did not ask whether he felt regret. It asked only how much longer he could endure this beauty. Far away, among the black crystal spires, a weak light trembled, not dawn, but the aftershock of a reminder passing through the bloodstream of the world. The bell had arrived, and Darak, with its blood flowers, black roses, and bone spines, was ready to bloom in the most painful way it knew. Dracula walked on, neither hurried nor hesitant, each step placed with deliberate precision, as though he were still moving through the corridors of a palace where servants waited for command. The habit had never left him, the habit of one long accustomed to being observed, of knowing that every movement carried weight and every deviation demanded payment. He stopped at the center of Darac's great hall. There was no throne here, no ceremony, only a space wide enough to require no witnesses. Dracula removed his gloves slowly, with care, as if shedding a layer of authority that no longer served a purpose in this moment. His hands were pale and steady, yet his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly, an old reflex born of years spent gripping a sword for too long. He pressed his palm to his chest, not where a heart would beat, but where the curse had anchored itself. The bell no longer rang, yet its aftershock remained, echoing evenly through his blood, a quiet reminder that prolonged silence was not peace, only delay. Dracula closed his eyes. Memory did not return as images, but as sensation. The weight of armor while standing on the battlements, the iron scent of blood when a blade was pulled free, the crushing awareness of an entire kingdom placing its survival into the decision of a single man. He remembered that moment with perfect clarity, not the moment of victory, but the moment before he accepted the curse. There had been no holy light and no voice descending from above. There had been only himself, blood, and a choice that, if left unclaimed, would have ended everything. He had knelt then not to beg, but to sign his name with his own existence. Now, within Darac, Dracula knelt once more, not from weakness, but because ritual demands absolute honesty. His knee touched the stone floor with a sound so faint it might have gone unnoticed elsewhere. Yet in the empty hall it carried weight, a confirmation spoken aloud that the one kneeling here had once been king. Dracula inhaled deeply and released the breath in a sound so soft it barely disturbed the air. Then he spoke, quietly, not for anyone but himself and Darac. Dracula's prayer.
Prin suferință m-am născut din nou. Prin răbdare am ținut regatul în viață. Nu cer iertare pentru sângele vărsat și nu cer lumină pentru noaptea pe care am ales-o. Accept lanțurile, dar nu uit coroana. Dacă trebuie să mă ridic din nou, să fie nu ca un monstru, ci ca ceea ce am fost când am îngenunchiat prima dată.
When the words ended, Dracula did not wait for an answer. This prayer was never meant to be rewarded or absolved. It was meant only to be heard by the one who had spoken it. He rose. The movement was clean and decisive, not the motion of one who had pleaded, but of a lord who had finished taking inventory of what still remained in his possession. He pulled the gloves back onto his hands. The chains did not fall away. The curse did not dissolve. But something had shifted. The human within him was no longer buried. The divine within him was no longer asleep. And Darac, for the first time in a very long while, was no longer merely a place to remain. It had become something that could be left behind, if necessary. Dracula turned away. He had not yet departed, but from that moment on he no longer knelt before silence. The city was still awake when the night had not yet fully closed. Oil lamps burned along the stone-paved streets, their dull yellow light trembling softly in the breeze, reflecting off walls and half-open windows. Voices drifted out from taverns that refused to sleep, layering into the familiar hum of human life. In the central square, the church bell rang in a steady rhythm, metal resonating slow and deep, carrying no warning at all. For those below, this night should have passed like any other. Dracula stood above them, not upon a tower and not among the clouds. He stood at a distance just far enough to remain unseen, yet close enough that every life in the city still held its full shape within his sight. His cloak fell straight, unmoving. The air around him thickened, pressing inward as if space itself were holding its breath, waiting for a decision that could not be taken back. He extended his hand. He drew no sigil, spoke no incantation, called no name. A thin cut opened across his palm, precise and clean. Blood welled up, dark and heavy, yet it did not fall. It hung suspended in the air, quivering faintly, as though gravity itself had forgotten its task. There was a sound, very slight, the quiet separation of flesh, and then nothing. Dracula closed his fingers. The blood answered. It spread from his palm, not bursting outward, not shattering, but unraveling into long, slender strands of deep crimson. They dropped straight down through the air, slicing invisible lines that rippled like disturbed water. When they touched the ground, the city reacted. Stone cracked with a dry, brittle sound beneath a house at the edge of the street. Walls shuddered, dust falling in pale sheets. A man stopped mid-step, turning his head without understanding, just as the stone beneath his feet caved inward. A scream rose sharp and high, then cut off. A hearth fire died without smoke. Light vanished from a window, leaving behind a hollow square of darkness. Then the blood pulled. The crimson threads tightened all at once. The sound that followed was not an explosion, but something deeper and heavier, like a massive weight being torn free from the earth. Stone fractured in succession. Wood groaned, then split. Entire rows of buildings twisted and leaned, not collapsing in a single direction, but wrenching out of alignment, as if their foundations had been yanked from where they belonged. Cries erupted everywhere. People shouted names in panic. Voices broke into sobs behind collapsing doors. Metal clanged against stone as bodies fell down stairways. The church bell rang wildly now, its rhythm lost, metal striking metal in a distorted, choking cry. The ground opened, not tearing wide like an earthquake and not sinking into a pit, but hollowing out. Houses slid, tilted, and vanished from sight as though pulled through a threshold that did not exist. People fell with them, arms flailing in empty air, mouths open, their screams swallowed before they could reach anyone else. Dracula looked down. His expression did not change. His gaze moved slowly, methodically, as though inspecting the outcome of a ritual practice too long to inspire doubt. The blood continued to move with the subtle tightening of his fingers, steady and exact, without excess. The city was erased, not burned, not blasted into ash. It was emptied, as though the weight of existence itself had been drawn out in a single breath. When the blood withdrew, the space below did not collapse at once. It held still for a heartbeat. Then the sky grew heavy. There was no rain and no wind. The air pressed down upon what remained, crushing it close to the ground like the world's chest clenched in a tightening grip. Sound faded away, leaving behind a silence so dense that the ears began to ring. Dracula raised his head. He felt it then, not retaliation, but refusal. Thunder did not roll in from afar. It was simply there. Light gathered in the sky, not flaring and not scattering, but dense, so dense that darkness could not push its way inside. The space above what had once been a city folded inward like a wound forced shut before it could bleed further. Perun appeared. He did not descend, and he did not charge forward. He stood as though sky, thunder, and judgment had always been waiting for this shape. The light around the god did not crack or explode. It held. Dracula looked at him, and for the first time something flickered across his face, not defiance and not fear, but confusion, as if he had only just realized that someone had chosen to step into the machinery of fate with their own body rather than allow it to grind the world beneath it. Perun said nothing. He lifted his hand, not to strike and not to warn, but to draw a line. The space between them thickened and froze. The last traces of blood suspended in the air trembled, then dissolved like mist under sunlight. Dracula lowered his hand, not because he was forced to, but because he had seen enough. He glanced once more at the void below, where a city had been, and then back at Perun.
You,
He said slowly, his voice low.
did not need to come.
Perun remained silent. That silence did not yield. The thunder pressed lower. Perun stepped forward, and from that moment on, the war that had only just begun was no longer Dracula's alone. Thunder did not strike, it sealed. The space around Perun thickened, as though the world itself had chosen to hold its breath for too long a moment. Light did not erupt or tear the sky apart. It gathered inward, compressed, carrying the weight of something older than judgment and heavier than command. Dracula felt the change at once, not as pain and not as fear, but as the withdrawal of permission. The blood within him, which moments earlier had moved freely and erased a city, slowed. It did not freeze and it did not vanish. It hesitated, as though reminded that before it had been a force, it had once been restrained. Dracula lowered his hand, not because he was afraid, but because the answer had already arrived. The space between him and Perun contracted, not distance, but allowance. What did not belong to the same depth of being was gently but absolutely pushed apart. Perun took one step forward, only one, and the sky yielded. There were no torn clouds and no lightning, no spectacle of storm. Instead, the firmament lowered, as though the ceiling of the world had bowed to something it recognized. Power was present, but it did not rush. It held itself. Dracula did not move. He stood straight, shoulders open, chin raised. It was not defiance. It was the posture of someone who had once stood before his own armies, knowing that the final command would cost him everything. Thunder passed through him, not as impact, not as force, but as presence. It was everywhere at once, not tearing flesh, not breaking bone, but loosening the bond between what he was and how he was allowed to exist. Dracula felt himself being unfastened, not destroyed, but unheld. His skin thinned, growing translucent, as though light no longer needed to ask permission to pass through him. The blood in his veins lost coherence. It did not boil or harden. It dispersed, separating from the idea of blood itself, becoming something finer, lighter. Dracula spoke then, his voice steady.
So this is not law.
He said.
This is will that chose restraint.
Perun answered without raising his voice.
Law is what remains,
He said.
after power learns where to stop.
Blood escaped from Dracula's form, not in jets or torrents, but as blood dust. Countless dark red particles drifted into the air like a dense mist. Each grain carried the echo of a heartbeat that had once sustained a kingdom. Dracula watched it happen without panic.
You let me endure.
He said.
You let me rot in continuity.
You were held,
Perun replied.
because if power moves without boundary, the world does not survive it.
Dracula exhaled slowly.
And if boundary forgets why it was built,
He said.
power will remind it.
Thunder pressed closer, not violently, but completely,
This is not your ending.
Perun said.
It is where your form can no longer follow your will.
Dracula's body began to dissolve, not by collapse and not by explosion, but by thinning from within. His chest lost density first, like smoke drawn out by an unseen current. Blood dust poured from where his heart had been, swirling briefly before dispersing, never touching the ground. His arms faded next, not severed, but unrecognized by reality as arms. His cloak unraveled into dark vapor, merging with the blood dust and vanishing like a vow that no longer had a bearer. In the final moment, his face remained. His eyes were open, not furious, not afraid, only aware.
So, the world keeps its shape
He said quietly.
by pretending power was never here.
Perun did not contradict him. The blood dust drifted across Dracula's features, blurring them like memory losing detail. His eyes closed, not in defeat, but because shape itself was no longer necessary. Dracula vanished. No body remained, no residue endured, only a faint veil of dark red smoke lingered, then thinned, then dissolved into the structure of the world, as though the space itself had learned how to forget him. The air where he had stood was empty, not broken, not sealed, simply absent. Perun held his hand aloft for one final measure, not to ensure obedience, but to complete the act. Then he lowered it. Thunder withdrew slowly, light thinned. The sky regained its familiar weight, though something beneath it had shifted. Perun remained still. He did not look at the emptiness Dracula had left behind. His gaze moved forward, toward distances not yet shaped, toward conflicts not yet named.
Power always returns.
He said softly.
Law only decides whether it arrives as ruin or memory.
He turned and walked away, not in haste, but with the certainty of one who knew this was not an ending. And where blood had become smoke, the world did not close itself fully. It remained slightly open, just enough for what had been restrained to find its way back when the time came.